Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Stephanie Michele Sweigart, a licensed and practicing school-based SLP out in Los Angeles, California. And my pronouns are she, her. And I'm here today with speechtherapypd.com. So thank you for joining us again on another episode on our YouTube channel. We have a returning guest here with us today. If you haven't caught her other episode, Dr. Karen Dudek-Brannan is with us on episode number 15, which is supporting students with building vocabulary. And here's a fun fact. As of the date that we are talking and recording this episode today, this is one of our highest watched episodes on the YouTube channel for speechtherapypd.com. So we are excited to have you back, Dr. Karen. Thank you for being here with us again today.
Well, thank you for having me. And I didn't realize it was the most watched episode. So that's exciting.
That is exciting. Absolutely. People love to learn about vocabulary. And we know that this is your area. You are an SLP with over 18 years of experience, and your research focuses on vocabulary and metalinguistic strategies. You've been published in several peer-reviewed journals. You are a school-based SLP, but interestingly, you also hold a certificate as a director of special education, and you are ASHA certified. So much going on. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We know that one of the projects that you were involved in previously with speechtherapypd.com was a course that's called Better Results with Less Effort, 3 Language Therapy Principles. Now, you had me at the less effort part, and I mean that in a positive way, because who doesn't want to work a little bit less and achieve a lot more doing so? I completely subscribe to that. So I think that brings so much curiosity in and of itself, and that sort of brings the golden question that I have for you today, and what a lot of SLPs and SLPAs might be thinking as we're just becoming completely overwhelmed with our growing caseloads and workload. Tell us the secrets, please. How can we, Karen, streamline our strategies to get more effective results in language therapy?
So what I think is really important to realize is that decision-making fatigue has a huge impact on the way that you show up for your students. So any way that you can have some kind of a framework for decision making that allows you to make a lot of decisions up front and kind of systematize your process after that is going to save you time. So it's not that we're winging it, it's just that we've done the work up front so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we show up for a session. If we've already committed to this whole process and we've done the work to understand how to quickly pull different parts of that process that we've gotten very proficient at, then that makes a lot of those decisions up front for us. It's almost like having a workout routine that you just commit to instead of having to make a decision about like, what weights do I lift? What exercises do I do? And decide on the spot. That really takes up a lot of energy. So that's the first thing that I'll say, is that you do really want to make sure that you're minimizing decision fatigue and understand what framework you're using that allows you to make good decisions, further down the line. And so the way that when I have mentored SLPs and the way that it's set up in my courses is that when we're thinking about how do I intervene as an SLP that needs to support language, especially when we're thinking about language and literacy for school age kids, obviously one of the biggest areas that we want to support is literacy. And so what I do is I have, if you think about vocabulary as this kind of overarching thing that's going to make an impact on your students, what you want to do is have a framework for figuring out what pieces do I target within this framework of vocabulary. So basically it's vocabulary, and then you have components under it, and then you start to fit the strategies under those components. And so it's not necessarily a rigid process where I'm saying this is the only way to do it, but it is a framework that allows you to help make some decisions and narrow things down, because vocabulary and language is so broad. So the 5 components for addressing vocabulary are phonology, orthography, morphology, semantics, and syntax. And so those are the big areas. So if we use that to organize that in our heads, then what we do is that we can come up with a set of strategies that are going to enable you to hit those 5 elements. And so we want to think about it from that standpoint, is that that's kind of our starting point. And then we can start to insert some of the strategies under those components. And then part of the way that we do it is that we want to pull in the idea of metalinguistic awareness. So it's not just about drilling words. It's more about studying words and giving kids strategies for learning words, thinking about words, talking themselves through the learning process. So having some kind of a strategy for how they talk to themselves, ask themselves questions to kind of look for information when they're reading, when they come up against an unfamiliar word, so that they are better able to learn words in the future. So it is somewhat about pulling actual words from the curriculum, but it's also about the strategy.
Okay, I'm loving this. So framework, have a framework in mind. We want to minimize the having to make so many decisions. We want to look at vocabulary as the vehicle for language, but under vocabulary, you're saying we have these 5 components that we want to look at, and within each of these, have a strategy on how to teach that vocabulary. And so it is about pulling from the curriculum, you're saying, but when we're looking at those words and study them, you're saying there's actually strategies to how we're going to go about studying those words. Do I have that right so far?
Yes.
I'm loving this. Okay.
So, I mean, the other thing that you want to think about, and what people often ask me, is when I tell them, so a lot of times people will come in to, my trainings, my on my mailing list and other things, and they'll always want to ask me about goals and assessment. And of course, that's something that we need to think about. But when we're thinking about aligning with the curriculum, and when we're thinking about building language skills, a lot of times people will say to me, well, don't I have to revise this IEP then if I'm going to work on something else? Or another thing that I've gotten, which I don't necessarily think is true, is that sometimes people will say, well, how do I write a morphology goal? If I'm going to work on morphology, my supervisor is making me write a goal for morphology. And so I want to emphasize the point that working on a strategy, that's the vehicle. The goal is the destination. So if you have goals for comprehension, inferencing, retelling stories, if you start to work on something like, morphology, that's going to build vocabulary, semantics, it's going to help you remember words more effectively and potentially be able to read a text and comprehend more effectively, you're actually working on the goals that you already have. So yes, as you learn this process, you should become more streamlined with the way that you write goals. And that is something that I address when I'm mentoring clinicians. But I actually start with the framework first, because I want people to understand the strategies. Typically, in most cases, you're probably already working on the same end goal. And then the same thing goes for curricular alignment. A lot of times people feel like, well, if the teacher's coming to me saying my students are having a difficult time comprehending, I have to just work on a comprehension goal. I have to just read paragraphs and have my students answer questions about them.
Like the who, what, where.
Yeah, and that's part of what you're doing, but you also have to build the language skills that are going to get you there. So you can still have that comprehension goal, but that doesn't mean that that's the only task that you work on in therapy in order to be curricularly aligned. And I would challenge people who are like, my supervisor is making me do this. I always say, are they really? Are they following you around throughout the day, seeing exactly what you're doing in therapy? Yeah, they sometimes will look at your goals and want them worded a certain way, but you still have autonomy over what strategies you use to get there. And so, just because you're changing the strategy doesn't necessarily mean that the end goal has to completely change. We're all still working towards that same end goal.
And I think that the supervisors probably would be very excited about and encourage these students to think outside the box and try new things and problem solve. I mean, because the experience really is about learning and finding the answers and accessing your inner wisdom rather than having someone just tell you what to do. So I really like this. I love the word framework. That is a big word for me that I love to have in my vocabulary. I love strategies. I love looking at lists of things so for example, for somebody who's listening to this episode, if I'm thinking about what you've shared today, and I'm saying, okay, I want to get a framework in place so that I'm front loading all of my work so that, again, I don't have so much decision fatigue and I'm not kind of willy-nillying things. How do I create that framework? Would you be able to give an example of where do I go? What do I do? What creates that framework initially?
So that is what I cover in my Language Therapy Advanced Foundations course, because there is a lot to it.
Okay.
I do have some resources that I can share to give some samples, but the way that I do it kind of at a high level, the way that I cycle through things is that I do start with semantics, and I teach a strategy called semantic feature analysis, where instead of just drilling words, we are teaching kids to self-question and think about words more effectively. So that's usually the first step where I start people, but then what kids have to learn to do in order to build their vocabulary skills is that they don't just have to expand the way that they think about words, they also have to condense and pick what's relevant. And so
Okay.
then I focus on the definition syntax and being able to define and describe words. And why this is so powerful is because number one, kids have to do it all the time for school, but number two, it kind of gets at the underlying skills that are required for kids to remember definitions. And a lot of times the way that people teach this is just the drilling, but that kind of bypasses the process of being able to pull out and pay attention to the relevant information about words. So that's
Okay.
really important as well. So you do need to have the right framework for studying words. So I'd say that that would be the first step. And that's kind of how I think about this is, semantic features, then focusing on relevant semantic features, and then cycling through to specific syntactic structures. So not just focusing on function or content words like nouns, verbs, and adjectives, but also thinking about function words and sentences to kind of glue those things together, because you have to be able to take those content words and structure them. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use words. So then I focus on specific sentence structures that tend to be an issue for students with language disorders, and as well as students who are learning English, as a second language. And then I tie it together and pull in some of those components of morphology, orthography, and phonology. And then we really want to kind of cycle through that process.
Okay. So going back to the self-questioning and then define and describe and going through it all over again. I love that framework.
And the thing is that what we want to realize is that with language skills, and I say this all the time, people think of it as like, I meet this skill and then I can move on to the next skill. And language just doesn't work like that. A lot of times you're not going to see the external thing, and you're not going to have this nice, neat, linear progression, because so much of this is internal. And that's why it is important that we kind of cycle through. A lot of times people are like, well, they're not meeting the goal. They're not saying, 3 out of 4 attributes on the semantic features goal or whatever. And, I said, that's okay. You can cycle through to the next skill, because you're never really just working on one thing. It's all connected. And so you don't necessarily have to meet these rigid criteria. And I know that a lot of times the way that we're taught to think about curriculum is like that, but it's not how language works. We have to be a little more flexible than that. And yes, we want to be as objective as possible, because that's how we're expected to do it in the special education system, or even if you're in healthcare and you have to bill insurance and things like that. But we do want to remember that we're planting the seeds for a lot of internal things. And so, we want to think about cycling through those things. And you also want to have that carryover phase where you are working on the high level comprehension things as well. So you're just sort of going through that whole thing and just continuing to cycle through it. And eventually what you're going to find is that kids are going to make progress with that. And you can kind of focus more on some of those high level things that involve integrating multiple language skills at once. So,
yes, and this kind of like checks back to your other episode that we were just talking about, where you said, you start to move into the conjunctions and you can challenge your kids with the bigger sentences. So I'm seeing where this all comes together. I love this so much. Okay, so you talked about how you have other resources where you share these frameworks, et cetera. Could you tell us a little bit more about where people can find you, where they can find more of your information, how they can get on your mailing list to get access to all of this valuable content that you have?
Sure. So to get the training where I go through the 5-component framework, and I do talk about some of the research under the different 5 components. So to register for that training, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language. And to just see the full course, that is drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. So just the whole thing.
Okay.
And then if you want to just get more information about just some of my other content that I talk about with regards to language, vocabulary, and then also just some of those different things that you need to think about when working as a team, whether it be a school clinician or whether you're in a private practice working with schools. I do have a podcast called De Facto Leaders, where I talk a lot about language, leadership, executive functioning, and just other career development things for related service providers. And so that podcast is at drkarendudek-brannan.com/blog.
Okay, wonderful. So many places. So what we're doing is we've compiled all of these links that you've just heard Dr. Karen share, and you can find them right below this episode, where you can click right on them and it'll take you right where you need to go for all these great resources and the podcast and everything that Dr. Karen is sharing. So thank you so much, Karen. For everybody that's listening, if you want to take a deeper dive into this topic and further your education, please check out Better Results with Less Effort, 3 Language Therapy Principles with Dr. Karen Dudek-Brannan. Because by the end of this course, participants really are going to be able to explain the rationale as to why language therapy can feel so overwhelming. You're going to be able to list 2 of the 5 critical features within teaching vocabulary, and you're going to name each of the 3 language principles, and you're going to be able to briefly explain them. So go ahead over to speechtherapypd.com to check out that course. For other topics, when you subscribe to speechtherapypd.com, you're going to get 1-year access for over 800 live and on-demand courses that are available for you. And when you take any of these courses or Dr. Karen's course, you're going to be able to scoop up those ASHA CEUs when you do so. So if you're new to speechtherapypd.com, you can access a free course. So be sure to check out that information below. There are a few free courses that are available that are just amazing that you have to check out. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I know you guys have loved Dr. Karen's other video. We've had a lot of views on that. She's got some great information. So just remember to go ahead and give it a thumbs up. You can also comment in the comment section below. We do want to hear from you. Let us know if you have any questions too in that comment section below. We are going to be back here next week answering more of those golden questions that SLPs and SLPAs are asking, and we have the answer for you. So stay tuned and check back with us next week.